$180 billion. That is what Dubai has poured into its built environment over the past 2 decades. The tallest tower on Earth, the largest artificial archipelago ever constructed, a city that materialized in the desert faster than any urban project in recorded history. But right now, beneath the glass and the gold, something is settling. And the question is not whether the cracks are there. The question is whether anyone in power wants to measure them. Dubai does not fail quietly. That is the paradox at the center of this story. Every system here was designed to announce success, to broadcast ambition, to make the improbable look inevitable. And for a long time, it worked. The city rewrote what a desert could become. But the same architecture of spectacle that built the myth is now the structure through which the fractures travel fastest. What you see from the outside still looks like a masterpiece. What you see from the inside is a different calculation entirely. We are going to walk through 3 layers of what is actually happening here. The physical layer. What the ground and the water are telling engineers that the press releases are not. The economic layer. What the numbers behind the numbers reveal about who this city was actually built for and whether those people are staying. And the systemic layer. The decisions made decades ago that made all of this not just possible, but, on current trajectories, difficult to reverse. If you leave before the 3rd layer, you will have the symptom without the cause. The cause is the part worth understanding. People who watch this kind of video tend to follow the data past the point where the official story stops. That is exactly who this was made for. Start with the ground itself. The Palm Jumeirah covers roughly 5.72 square kilometers of reclaimed land in the Persian Gulf. It was constructed by dredging approximately 120 million cubic meters of sand from the seabed and depositing it into engineered formations. The project was announced in 2000. Construction began in 2001, and by 2008, the first residents were moving into villas that cost upward of $4 million. The engineering was extraordinary. The marketing was even more extraordinary. And for a while, those 2 things pointed in the same direction. Then the measurements started coming in. Independent surveys carried out over the following decade found that parts of the Palm were settling at rates that exceeded initial projections. The reclaimed sand compresses over time. That is physics, not failure. But the rate matters. If the settlement is uniform, structures adapt. If it is differential, meaning some sections sink faster than others, you get stress on foundations, on pipe joints, on roads, on the underground infrastructure that runs through the entire front system. By the early 2010s, reports from engineers working on the island documented drainage problems, cracking in road surfaces, and structural assessments that required remediation work the original timeline had not budgeted for. The UAE government has not published a comprehensive public audit of the Palm's structural condition. What exists is a patchwork of developer disclosures, engineering consultancy reports, and the testimony of residents who found that their waterfront paradise required maintenance at a scale that the original sales documentation had not prepared them for. Here is the question this raises. If a government builds something this visible, this iconic, this inseparable from the national brand, at what point does acknowledging a structural problem become a political act rather than an engineering one? Leave that question in the air. It matters more as the story deepens. Now go one layer down, past the engineering, into the economics. Because the Palm's physical condition is a symptom, the economic logic underneath it is the cause. Dubai's growth model from the late 1990s onward was built on a single premise: attract foreign capital by making the city the most impressive place on earth to park money, start a business, and live without the friction of taxes, regulations, or political accountability. It worked. Between 2000 and 2008, property prices in Dubai increased by over 300%. Developers launched projects before the foundations were poured and sold them off-plan, meaning buyers paid for apartments that did not yet exist. The word speculation barely covered what was happening. It was a structured system for converting confidence into construction, and then converting construction back into confidence. As long as both directions of that cycle moved simultaneously, the numbers held. 2008 broke the cycle. Dubai's property market fell by roughly 50% between 2008 and 2011. Projects were abandoned mid-construction. The skyline filled with cranes that stopped moving. Workers lost their jobs. Developers defaulted. Nakheel, the state-linked company that built the Palm Jumeirah, required a bailout from Abu Dhabi that was announced in late 2009 and eventually reached approximately $26 billion. The city, that had presented itself as immune to the cycles that flatten other markets, discovered that it had not transcended those cycles. It had amplified them, because the same velocity that generates extraordinary growth generates extraordinary contraction when the sentiment turns. Would you have bought a $2 million apartment in a building that was 80% sold but 0% constructed, with no independent escrow protection, in a legal system where foreign buyers had limited recourse if the developer stopped building? Thousands of people did. Many of them were not reckless. They were working from information that the market was presenting as credible. The mechanism that failed them was not stupidity. It was a system that privatized the gains during the upswing and distributed the losses broadly during the collapse. That distinction matters. Drop one layer further, because the 2008 crisis was not the end of the story. It was the end of the first chapter. Dubai's response to the crisis is where the systemic pattern becomes visible. The government of Dubai, under Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, did not restructure the underlying model. It recapitalized it. Between 2012 and 2019, prices recovered, then surpassed their 2008 peaks in many segments. New mega-projects launched. Expo 2020, delayed to 2021 due to the pandemic, injected demand. The population grew from roughly 2 million in 2010 to an estimated 3.6 million by 2023. On the surface, the story looked like resilience, and in certain measurable ways, it was. But the structure underneath had a new quality that the previous cycle had not. The buyers driving the post-2012 recovery were increasingly concentrated among a narrower demographic. Ultra-high net worth individuals, many of them from Russia, China, India, and other markets experiencing their own political or economic turbulence, were not buying Dubai property because they believed in Dubai's economy. They were buying it because they needed a place to hold capital outside the reach of their own governments. Dubai's property market had shifted from a speculative growth market to a wealth preservation market. That sounds like a promotion. It is actually a vulnerability in a different shape. Here is why. A growth market attracts buyers who believe prices will rise. They stay when prices stabilize and leave when prices fall significantly. A wealth preservation market attracts buyers who need safety more than returns. They tend to hold, but they also tend to buy at volume and at speed during their own crises. Then stop buying entirely when their crisis resolves or deepens past the point of liquidity. The demand is episodic. It is not structural. It does not generate the kind of deep, diversified, resident-driven economy that sustains a city across a full cycle. Look at the numbers. According to research published by property consultancy Knight Frank, Dubai saw a record number of transactions above $10 million in 2022 and 2023, driven partly by a wave of buyers relocating capital out of Russia following the sanctions regime that followed the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. That influx was real, measurable, and it moved prices. The trajectory it created, if that wave subsides or reverses, points toward a segment of the market that is very expensive and very thin. The record volumes were not evidence that Dubai had built a sustainable residential economy. They were evidence that Dubai had become a preferred destination for money in motion. Those are not the same thing. Drop to the deepest layer, the one nobody in the promotional material ever mentions. Dubai has no income tax, no capital gains tax, no inheritance tax. That is the headline. The mechanism behind the headline is what matters. The city funds itself through fees, levies, government-linked enterprise revenues, and the economic activity generated by the population it attracts. That model works extraordinarily well when the population is growing, when construction is active, when tourism is expanding, and when trade volumes through Jebel Ali, the largest port in the Middle East, are rising. Every one of those variables has performed strongly in recent years. But each one of them is a flow, not a stock. They depend on continuous inputs from outside the system. Mohammed Al-Abbar, the founder of Emaar Properties, the developer behind the Burj Khalifa and the Dubai Mall, said in multiple public forums in the 2010s that Dubai's goal was to be not just the most impressive city in the world, but the most livable. Livability requires infrastructure that serves a resident population, not a transient one. It requires schools, hospitals, public transport, affordable housing in a range of price points, and legal frameworks that give long-term residents a stake in the place, rather than a temporary permit that can be withdrawn. Dubai has built extraordinary infrastructure. It has not yet built the institutional framework that converts impressive visitors into permanent stakeholders. The visa system is the clearest example. For most of its modern history, Dubai's residency structure was tied to employment. Lose your job, and you have a short window to either find another one or leave. The government recognized this as a structural weakness and introduced the Golden Visa program in 2019, allowing high net worth individuals, skilled professionals, and certain investors to obtain 10-year renewable residency that is not tied to a single employer. That was a real reform. But as of the most recent data available from UAE government publications, the Golden Visa remains out of reach for the vast majority of Dubai's population, which includes an enormous number of low-wage workers from South Asia who build the towers, staff the restaurants, and maintain the infrastructure. Their stake in the city is still entirely conditional on their employers' willingness to keep them. That asymmetry does not weaken the skyline, it weakens the floor beneath it. There is a researcher whose work illuminates this precisely. Samer Saliba, an urban planning analyst whose research on Gulf cities has been published through the Arab Reform Initiative, has argued that Dubai's governance model creates a city that is optimized for the gaze of the visitor rather than the experience of the resident. The physical environment is engineered for impressiveness. The legal environment is engineered for capital. The gap between those two priorities and the daily experience of the majority of people who actually live there is not an accident. It is an architectural choice, made at the level of policy, sustained across decades, because it serves the capital attraction function that the model requires. That is the systemic level. That is where the logic closes. Now watch what happens when you hold all three layers simultaneously. The physical layer tells you that extraordinary engineering at speed on reclaimed land produces maintenance obligations that were not fully priced into the original cost structure. The economic layer tells you that the demand model has shifted from a growth story to a capital refuge story, and that the buyers driving that shift are responding to conditions in their home countries, not to underlying fundamentals in Dubai. The systemic layer tells you that the governance architecture was built to attract and process capital, not to generate the kind of rooted, diversified, politically invested population that weathers cycles. Stack those three observations, and the question they produce is not whether Dubai can continue to grow. It probably can, on present conditions, for some time. The question is what it is growing into. A city that adds population but not permanence. A skyline that adds towers but not trust. A model that adds records but not resilience. If the current trajectory holds, the decade ahead looks less like the continued rise of a global city and more like the slow proof of a hypothesis that nobody in the promotional apparatus wants to test. Consider the workers at the base of all of this. The International Labour Organization has documented, in reports from 2018 through 2023, persistent issues with wage protection, contract substitution, and the debt bondage that traps migrant laborers who borrowed money in their home countries to pay recruitment fees before arriving in Dubai. The city's wage protection system, introduced in 2009, was a genuine attempt to enforce payment. Compliance rates have improved, but enforcement gaps remain, and the workers who fall through those gaps do not have the institutional channels to close them. They are not permanent residents. They are not voters. They are not customers for the properties they build. They are the invisible infrastructure of the city's economy. And they are also its most structurally exposed population. This is the number that should settle over everything else. The Burj Khalifa stands 828 meters above sea level. It is the tallest structure ever built. Its construction cost approximately $1.5 billion. It opened in 2010 at the height of the post-crisis renegotiation, in a city that had just required a $26 billion rescue from its neighbor. The building was not a sign of recovery. It was a sign of commitment to the story of recovery. The distinction is architectural. The consequences are financial. And that is the paradox Dubai has built itself into. The more spectacular the monument, the more the monument must be defended against the reality that produced it. Every record broken requires the next record to maintain the gravity that pulls capital and talent and ambition toward this particular patch of desert. And every record requires more from a system that, at its base, rests on sand, not metaphorically, literally. The sand that was dredged from the Gulf floor and shaped into palm fronds and archipelagos and artificial beaches is still compressing, still settling. The measurements continue. The question is not whether the settling will stop. The question is whether anyone will choose to read the measurements honestly before the next cycle begins. That is a question no single person in Dubai can answer alone. If this kind of analysis, the kind that follows the architecture of a system, past the point where the official story stops, is why you are here, subscribe and turn on the bell. This channel exists for people who need to understand how the structures around them actually work, not how they are presented. That is a different kind of knowledge. It is worth protecting. The content of this video is based on strategic analysis reports, verified data, and projected scenarios regarding the economic and geopolitical context described. The information is provided for reference purposes, independent analysis, and documentary storytelling. It does not constitute financial, legal, or investment advice. The images and materials used serve to illustrate the argument